In 1997, a South Korean video game developer by the name of NCSoft was born, with one goal in mind: to distribute massively multiplayer online games. A year later, they published Lineage 1 in South Korea, in the same timeline as Ultimate Online and Tibia. The success of Lineage 1 laid a foundation for what would soon become one of the most powerful MMO publishers in the world. With games like Lineage 2, Aeon, Guild Wars, and Blade & Soul, NCSoft was now building its presence in the West. They would later enter the mobile gaming market, elevating the company into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But that success came at a cost. They began cancelling games left and right, most notably Wildstar in 2018. They became more aggressive with the microtransactions and pay-to-win mechanics. And today, NCSoft is now facing the lowest point in the company's history, a collapse that could now mark the beginning of the end. My name is Muscles, and this is Chapter 1.
One of the world's most popular, massively multiplayer online games, NCSoft. He's Executive Vice President of Publishing for NCSoft, Ross Borton. Ross, welcome into Tomorrow.
By the early 2000s, South Korea was beginning to establish itself as a growing force in online gaming. Internet cafes were exploding in popularity, and even at one point, video game addiction was starting to become a real issue.
A couple was convicted last year of letting their baby starve to death while they spent countless hours playing an online game.
Initially, Lineage 1 was published in both North America and South Korea, but it wasn't nearly as successful in the West, and this time they wanted that to change with Lineage 2. In 2001, NCSoft acquired Destination Games, a studio co-founded by Ultimate creator Richard Garriott, and brought him on as executive producer for Lineage 2, best known for his contributions to the Ultimate series. He claimed that they wanted Lineage 2 to be a worldwide success, and not just an Asian MMO. With his background in Western game development, he was likely seen as the bridge that could help NCSoft finally break into the Western market. But before they could expand globally, NCSoft wasn't alone in this fast-evolving landscape. They still had to deal with growing competition in their own region, specifically from other Korean-developed MMOs. MapleStory brought something entirely different to the table, with its 2D side-scrolling gameplay and heavy focus on character customization. Fliff Online, also known as Fly for Fun, introduced a unique flight mechanic allowing players to travel using brooms and hoverboards, adding a new layer to exploration and traversal. And Ragnarok Online, with its anime-inspired visuals and class-based progression, built a stronger player base thanks to its approachable design. However, some would argue that Lineage 2 was still one step ahead, offering a full 3D mmorpg experience at a time when many of its competitors still used 2D visuals and simpler mechanics. And so, when they launched Lineage 2 as a prequel to the original game, NCSoft was able to continue its momentum. It quickly became another well-received MMO among South Korean players, expanding on the original with improved visuals and new gameplay systems. You could tell it was made by developers who were both passionate and ambitious, trying to create something that pushed the boundaries of what online games could deliver at the time. While Lineage 2 introduced dungeons, quests, minigames, and other things, the endgame was always about PvP. With the ability to own a castle that would give you real power, access to special items, and unique advantages, players would schedule massive clan battles to fight for control. But despite its popularity in South Korea, NCSoft fell short of turning Lineage 2 into a global success, especially when they had to face other monsters in the process. Blizzard was already dominating multiple genres with Diablo 2 and Warcraft 3, and in 2004 they were preparing to launch World of Warcraft, a title that would go on to redefine the entire MMO genre. That same year also saw the release of two more iconic MMOs, EverQuest 2 and RuneScape, which had just transitioned from its classic version into what was known as RuneScape 2, quickly cementing its place as one of the best MMOs of all time. So, when NCSoft launched both the North American and European version of Lineage 2 in 2004, the odds were stacked against them. And while the game did manage to build a dedicated following in certain regions, it never reached the level of global success that they had hoped for. But it seemed like the Lineage franchise was really just the beginning for NCSoft. Around the time Lineage 2 launched in South Korea, NCSoft also became a public company, With new stakeholders and investors on board, expansion quickly became a top priority. They were still very determined to expand globally, so much so that NCSoft went on to publish 9 more MMOs over the next decade, launching a separate branch known as NC West and acquiring multiple game studios in the process. They were publishing MMOs like City of Heroes, where players had to defend Paragon City from villains, or Auto Assault, a game that combined vehicle combat with RPG elements in a post-apocalyptic setting, or even Tabula Rasa, Richard Garriott's own attempt at making a third-person sci-fi MMO. NCSoft was trying to do everything, and while MMOs were their main focus, they also explored other genres, like trying to publish Point Blank in South Korea, a tactical first-person shooter similar to something like Counter-Strike, or Extel, where players controlled customizable mechs in fast-paced arena battles. Even if they weren't always directly involved in development, they tried very hard to succeed beyond South Korea. And while NCSoft did manage to establish a solid presence in the West with games like Guild Wars 2, Aeon, and Blade and Soul, it wasn't enough to capture a global dominance. Once again, despite NCSoft's early efforts to expand globally with games other than the Lineage franchise, most of these MMOs were eventually shut down, often just a few years after launch.
And speaking of updates, City of Heroes, those that are playing that game, recent updates, something new happening there?
Yeah, sure. City of Heroes is more of a Western title for us. This was developed here in California, and City of Heroes has been around for almost 7 years now, and so within the next couple of months we'll be releasing our 20th major content update, and this is what we do. The game has been amazingly strong for us, and our players are excited to see that.
Despite claiming that the game was doing well, NCSoft decided to shut down Paragon Studios entirely, the team that was responsible for the game, and eventually closing City of Heroes in 2012. Auto Assault, their post-apocalyptic car combat MMO, was shut down just a year after release, likely a result of targeting an audience far removed from traditional MMO players. Dungeon Runners followed in 2010, and Tabula Rasa, the ambitious sci-fi project led by Richard Garriott, was shut down in 2009 after failing to gain traction. And finally, Wildstar, a game many assumed would be around for years, one that many of us took for granted, was taken offline in 2018. I feel like NCSoft was involved in too many projects while trying hard to break into the Western market. It didn't make sense for them to keep investing in so many different MMOs, only for a majority of them to shut down later. And even though they helped create some of the MMOs we love to play, this was the real first sign that things were starting to fall apart. After going public in 2003, the pressure to grow and satisfy investors began to shape the company's decisions. While most of their MMOs were still relying on traditional subscription models, that was no longer enough. The shareholders wanted more, and so they were forced to go back to the drawing board to figure out the new strategy. Looking through the financial reports year after year, one thing was impossible to ignore. South Korea remained their most profitable region by far. They knew they could rely on Korean players to keep spending money on their games, and because of that, they shifted their focus towards a new trend. A trend that wasn't about building great games anymore, but chasing whatever they could sell. The passion from a game developer would now be overshadowed by the guy wearing a suit, and for the first time ever, NCSoft was about to tarnish its reputation in a way players would never forget. Cosmetic items, XP boosts, battle passes, you name it, they're everywhere. And together, they make up over 80% of all gaming revenue in today's market. They become a core part of how modern games make money, whether through small purchases or more aggressive monetization systems. And whether we like it or not, microtransactions are now a fundamental part of the industry that players have to deal with. But that wasn't always the case. especially not in MMOs. They were largely driven by the rise of free-to-play games in the early 2000s. The idea was simple: let more players access the game for free, let them invest enough time, and eventually they would feel inclined to spend more money. Nexon's MapleStory was one of the first MMOs to embrace this model, offering cosmetics and convenience items through an in-game store. Fliff Online followed a similar path, giving players full access while monetizing optional purchases. These early adopters laid the groundwork for the monetization systems that would soon become the standard across the industry. For NCSoft specifically, their experimentation with this business model began in 2008 with the introduction of NC Coin, a virtual currency players could buy with real money and use for in-game items. It was first implemented in Excel, the third-person mech shooter, where players could upgrade weapons, skills, and armor using this currency. It's safe to say it wasn't the success they were hoping for, as Excel would be shutting down in 2010. But it wouldn't be long before NCSoft brought that same monetization system and approach into their flagship MMOs. Lineage 2 received many expansion packs over the years, but in 2011, one particular update had a lasting impact on player expectations: the Goddess of Destruction. It was advertised as truly free, meaning that for the first time ever, the game would no longer require a monthly subscription to play. And with that change came the shift to a free-to-play model built around microtransactions, which was obviously made possible by the premium currency NC Coin. They introduced an in-game store featuring cosmetic bundles, skins, and other items, but more importantly, XP boosts and various supplies. In 2012, Aeon followed the same direction, rebranding itself as truly free in the West with the release of version 3.0 Ascension. The subscription model was removed, and NC Coin became central to the game's monetization. Just like Lineage 2, players could now purchase premium packs, XP boosts, and other helpful items. And then in 2016, it was time for Blade & Soul, launched in the West as a free-to-play title. It featured a dual currency system known as Hung Moon coins earned through gameplay, and NC Coin as the real money premium currency. Both were used in the game's cash shop, which offered cosmetics and progression-based items that were accessible directly within the game. Some players would argue that many of these microtransactions weren't initially game-breaking, since you could still acquire items and progress your character without needing to spend money. But many of us had no idea just how far it would eventually go. Systems that used to rely on effort and time gradually turned into things you could simply pay for. One example of this was the socketing and enchanting system in Aeon, which relied heavily on RNG. Players could originally acquire supplements in the game to improve their odds of successfully socketing mana stones or enhancing gear. But eventually, NCSoft began selling these supplements through the cash shop, often during limited time sales. This meant that they were now starting to introduce FOMO-driven practices, alongside the very same systems that change over time for the sake of turning your character progression into a gamble. But outside of Asia, things became even worse for Aeon, as NCSoft handed over the European publishing rights to Gameforge, a German publisher notorious for aggressively monetizing their games. The Ascension update, which was supposed to mark a new era for Aeon, ended up being one of the worst things to happen to the game in Europe. One detailed forum post compiled dozens of links, highlighting community backlash, complaints, and claims of mismanagement and even corruption by Gameforge. The European players were repeatedly frustrated by inconsistent updates, poor communication, and a monetization model built heavily around loot boxes and pay-to-win systems. It actually got so bad that players eventually launched a public petition, demanding that NCSoft take back the publishing rights entirely.
The Western players are able to provide feedback directly to the development team, and the next patch is going to address a lot of their concerns and feedback, and we're going to improve the product on a constant basis. And we're going to have priority one being servicing these users.
Cool. Well, Team Ion doing the job, generating all the hype and keeping up to it, living up to the hype. So, Lance, thanks for spending a few minutes.
But unfortunately, it seemed like NCSoft was no longer interested in serving their Western audience, as they would continue to disappoint them in other ways. The Aeon Vision trailer promised underwater cities, swimming, and tameable mounts, features that, according to players, still doesn't exist in the game. And for the features that were eventually added, most of them showed up years later and looked very different from what was originally shown. To this day, fans still return to that trailer, leaving comments about how disappointed they are with NCSoft. And it wasn't just trailers. Over the years, NCSoft would publicly make promises during previews, reassuring players that pay-to-win mechanics wouldn't be included, only to introduce the very same systems later but under a different name. They also did that with Blade and Soul, promising that players wouldn't be able to buy gear, power, or other gameplay advantages. But later on, they introduced a treasure trove, a seasonal gacha event where players could spend money to acquire powerful materials and other useful items. This kind of misleading marketing would become a pattern, one that players began to recognize across many other games. At this point, NCSoft was a completely different company, a shell of their former self. Any ambition they had to grow beyond South Korea had already faded away. The feedback raised by players who wanted to see the games improve was ignored or silenced, especially from the Western audience. It no longer mattered whether the games were actually good, only that they looked good. With flashy trailers and interviews spread across social media, many were built on empty promises. And more importantly, the cosmetic items, XP boost, and gacha mechanics, more of them were being added one by one. As time went on, in-game systems began to rely more on RNG, and their games would now become soulless. But despite all the criticism from their player base, NCSoft still remained highly profitable, especially in their home market. South Korea was still responsible for the majority of their revenue, and the shift to a free-to-play model backed by aggressive monetization practices continued to work across all of their games. There were no incentive to address player concerns, and no pressure to change. And so instead, they chose to double down. The same monetization model that had already proven successful would now be used on a different audience, one that could access their games anytime and anywhere. They were going to enter a new era of video games, one that would soon change the gaming industry forever. Out of all the games NCSoft developed and published over the years, there was always one title they could rely on to be profitable: Lineage 1. This MMO was responsible for generating over $1 billion in revenue in less than a decade. In fact, it was so successful that it earned twice as much as Lineage 2 did during that period of time. It seemed to have outperformed every other game in their catalog, and honestly, it makes sense. This was NCSoft's very first entry to the industry, one that South Korean players stuck with for so many years. And in the same way that many of us get to relive the nostalgia by playing our own Western old school MMOs, they get to do the same. So it only made sense for NCSoft to keep using the Lineage franchise as a foundation to generate more revenue in other ways. In 2016, they licensed the Lineage IP to another company known as Netmarble, who then developed and published Lineage 2 Revolution for mobile. This move allowed NCSoft to not only profit from the licensing deal, but to also observe how players responded to experiencing Lineage on a different platform, and it would end up becoming a massive success. Revolution managed to generate over $1 billion in global revenue. It quickly became a turning point for NCSoft, not just because of how profitable the mobile MMO market was, but because they believed they could achieve even more if they published the next one themselves. You can only imagine what NCSoft did next. So the following year, NCSoft took that idea into their own hands and released Lineage M, a portable version of the PC game, now available on mobile. The game that South Koreans always loved playing on PC, and for many, their first ever MMO was now playable on Android and iOS platforms. They kept it as close to the original as possible, avoiding major changes or attempts to remaster or redesign the experience, with one exception: the introduction of gacha mechanics and pay-to-win systems. And surprisingly, it worked. Lineage Mobile didn't just replicate the success of Revolution, it completely immediately surpassed it, setting new records for mobile game sales worldwide. It became one of the most downloaded applications on the Google Play Store in multiple countries, and generated over $1 billion in revenue within its first year. In fact, Lineage Mobile became so successful that it now holds a place among the top 15 highest grossing mobile games of all time. That's how much money this MMO would go on to make across its lifetime, and sure as hell was a reality check for NCSoft's investors and shareholders. They already knew there was money to be made in this market, but they now also realized just how little they actually needed to invest. And so instead of spending millions of dollars trying to develop brand new games, they could simply adapt their existing MMOs for mobile players. A combination of nostalgia and accessibility would now become their most powerful selling point. NCSoft began developing mobile versions for nearly every major title they had previously released on PC. The Lineage franchise alone would receive 5 separate titles, all set within the same universe. Blade and Soul would also receive its own mobile adaptations, using the IP to capitalize on its dedicated fanbase. They even went as far to resurrect older games that had been shut down, like Trickster Online, a game originally developed and published by another Korean company in 2003, but its official servers shut down in 2014. They pretty much went through their entire catalog of games to see what they could bring back or adapt for the mobile market. And in 2021, after years of building towards this strategy, NCSoft would achieve its highest stock price in the company's history. They had now fully cemented themselves as one of the most powerful MMO publishers in the world. But somewhere along the way, things began to change for NCSoft. While they had reached their peak of their success, it would soon come at a greater cost. Their shift to adapting MMOs for the mobile gaming market had brought them incredible success, but much of that seemed to have been built by unethical practices, even to the detriment of their most loyal South Korean players. In 2024, over 1,000 gamers filed a formal complaint with Korea's Fair Trade Commission, accusing NCSoft of operating hidden super accounts in Lineage M, granting unfair item access and manipulating the in-game economy in ways that pressured regular players to spend more. In 2021, NCSoft faced backlash and a 15% drop in stock price after players accused the company of misleading marketing and disguising pay-to-win mechanics in Blade and Soul 2. Some users even filed lawsuits, accusing NCSoft of heavily sponsoring YouTubers and streamers to promote Lineage 2M in misleading ways, encouraging viewers to spend money on loot boxes under false impressions. One Lineage mobile player, who claimed to have spent over $3.5 million, sued NCSoft after a rollback left his purchases only partially refunded, leading to outrage and a protest outside NCSoft's headquarters. Going even further back, in 2010, NCSoft lost a $30 million lawsuit to the former employee Richard Garriott. The man they had initially brought in now became their biggest enemy, after it was revealed that the company had faked his resignation letter in an effort to force him out. Whether you believe all of these allegations or not, NCSoft was repeatedly accused of unethical practices and anti-consumer behavior over the years. No matter where you come from, reading headlines about a company mistreating its player base will always damage its reputation. And while they could afford to ignore their Western audience, losing the trust of their South Korean players would prove to be a costly mistake, because, well, they were the foundation of the company's billion-dollar empire. But this was only one part of the equation. One particular case study showed that over 70% of Lineage mobile players at launch were over 30 years old. The study highlighted how mobile games at first were typically dominated by players in their teens and 20s, but with the release of MMOs like Lineage, it brought back older players who had enjoyed the series when they were much younger. And as many of us know, nostalgia has been proven to be a powerful drug, but one that doesn't last very long. While some developers have managed to maintain a loyal player base for nostalgic MMOs through community-driven updates and by offering new ways to play their games, NCSoft has relied too much on recycling older games for the mobile market, without offering any meaningful changes. And I usually don't have a problem with MMOs that focus on the nostalgia. After all, many of us still choose to play these older games today because of how good they are still considered. But when developers continue to shove the same aggressive monetization model with gacha mechanics and other pay-to-win systems, well then players will eventually move on. It just became more clear over time that NCSoft had lost much of the creativity and innovation they once had. Since shifting their focus to mobile gaming, they had only released one true MMO for the PC market. While Blade and Soul Neo did launch on PC, it was once again just a remastered version of the original, and it still failed to gain much traction in both South Korea and in the West. Throne of Liberty, on the other hand, was originally envisioned as a spiritual successor to Lineage. It spent over a decade in development before finally launching in South Korea, where NCSoft was forced to admit to investors that the game had severely underperformed. In a desperate attempt to revive the game, NCSoft brought Throne of Liberty to the very same Western audience they had long ignored. And yeah, judging by the player numbers now, it was simply too late. Eventually, the company was forced into a major restructuring in 2024, laying off hundreds of employees, cancelling projects that had been in development for years, and suffering a staggering drop in stock price that many people now would consider to be the downfall of NCSoft. It really sucks that I never actually got to play this MMO. While I spent countless hours writing the script, doing the research for a bunch of different games, and trying to edit this video in Sony Vegas, despite all of the annoying crashes, I slowly came to a realization that NCSoft had lost something very special. Everything from the music to the gameplay and the world of Lineage felt like a gem. A game that seemed to have created some truly great memories for a lot of players. And while I was busy grinding out woodcutting in old school RuneScape, or trying to level up a Tauren Shaman in classic WoW, I unfortunately missed out on playing Lineage. But worse than that, I missed out on a whole generation of MMOs that were thriving in another part of the world. While things aren't looking great for NCSoft right now, it's not entirely over just yet. They did announce Aeon 2, which a lot of content creators and players are currently talking about, and apparently they still have a few other titles for release very soon. And to be fair, I think they deserve a bit of credit for still trying to make games in a genre as stagnant as MMOs. I'm still hoping that they can make the right decisions moving forward and recover from the greed. But given their track record and everything we've seen over the years, I'm not gonna hold my breath. So let me know in the comment section below if this is something you would like to see more of. And yeah, thank you guys for watching the video.